Haidong! In this video, we're going to talk about aspects of Form 1. Previously on this channel, I talked about each form, again, having its own aspect, right? So for example, things you learn in Form 1, in Form 2, you're going to keep working on those things as well as learning other things. Form 3 keeps building off again what you learned in the previous one. So it's a very cumulative martial art, which is why I really like this, especially as a teaching mechanism, especially for Ssangsu. So Ssangsu in particular, and again, this is part of the reason why we do Ssangsu first, is very cumulative. So what I like to do is talk about each of the forms, again, at least 3 things you can think about as you, again, introduce this form, or at least, not necessarily even introduce it, even as you're kind of training through it. These are, again, things that are introduced in each of these forms, or it's kind of like a new way of thinking about an aspect that you learned before. Now, Form 1 is allegedly the form that you learn first, right? So this is allegedly like someone who has no sword experience, maybe not even any martial arts experience, like no experience whatsoever. They're given this form to, as their introduction. Right? So it's probably going to be a lot of different things to introduce, right? So again, I tend to be very front heavy with my students, so again, kind of like, trial by fire. But that said, again, the actual form, so Form 1, is pretty standard. So the very first thing is something that seems kind of intuitive, right? You're learning how to draw and put a sword away. Now you might think duh, right? It is a sword form. You are expected to both draw and put the sword away. So what makes this so special, right? The main thing is doing this both efficiently, efficiently in terms of, speed, in terms of not damaging your own body, and again, all sorts of other aspects, especially not being able to look at not necessarily having to look at your scabbard as you put the sword away. These are all aspects that are a little bit difficult to pick up, right? So you can probably imagine from your own experience when you first learned how to both draw and put the sword away, it took a fair amount of time to get comfortable with it, right? So the very beginning of the form, right? So the idea is, again, you have your ready position, someone's coming at you, trying to, assault you, end your life. So you want to make sure you have some space, right? So the idea is you're not like, all right, I'm going to look at this. The idea is like, all right, I'm seeing you. I need to make sure I'm still looking at everything. I need to be able to draw my sword without, relying on looking at it, right? So again, I see something coming in, clear them, right? And then from there, getting back your distance, right? And then at the very end, right? So you're here, cut through, and then cut back. So kind of checking around, making sure no one is trying to murder you to death, and then you're good. The idea is all right, so when you first learn it, this might be okay, but then there's going to be a lot more to think about, right? So, all right, so when I draw the sword, everything needs to smooth out, right? So again, what I just did is sort of okay for the first couple weeks of someone learning how to draw the sword, but ideally you want to smooth it out, right? So as I'm moving forward, as my body mass is moving forward, I'm going grabbing, turning, breaking the seal, all of that on one clean motion, and then conjunct, and eventually put away. So again, the put away has a lot of different aspects as well. I think I talked about this as well. But again, that's going to be a major aspect of Form 1. Again, you won't be like, right? Or even here, you're like, all right, I want to make sure, again, I know where the sword is. Again, in Gumdo, you can use your index and thumb. All right, I'm good, I'm good, I'm good. Another aspect is going to be moving with the blade. So again, all of these things are super obvious, especially if you've done many years of Gumdo. But again, moving with the sword, right? So if you only did basics, you mostly did things in Kimase, or again, you may have started doing some of, again, front, back, left, right, but again, pretty small constrained spaces, right? Which is intended to be, right? Because basics are intended to be done in large groups without you hurting each other, which is why we have that very regimented kind of, progression of it. But again, the idea of is me being able to move while cutting. It's not just going to be right? The idea is to, so obviously be able to move, right? So think about where your center of mass is and how you can propel that forward. but also the muscle groups that you activate as well as your breathing. So I talked about an aspect in the past, so again, I'm taking this from Isabella Church Sensei, with Kiken Tai Ichi, right? So your breathing, your body, and your sword, yeah, all those three things in one clean motion, right? So again, with the body, you want to be engaging the right muscle groups, right? So again, these aren't muscle groups that you naturally use if you're not thinking about it, right? So again, when you're walking down the street, you're not thinking about your glute, you're not thinking about your core, you're not thinking about like in the deep shoulder, you're just kind of like moving through the world. Versus when you're using this with a sword, you're here, activate that glute, activate the lower back, activate the thigh, activate the core, activate your breathing, deep shoulder instead of top shoulder. Makes sense? So again, on paper it sounds like, yeah, I'm moving with the sword. But you're moving with the sword, right? So you're engaging, again, the right muscle groups, you're breathing, you're kind of like learning how to breathe properly, and you're going to be able to, again, attack or defend while in motion, right? Because obviously a target in motion is harder to hit, and also moving around the target, that's going to give you a little more opportunity, kind of like see the opponent's defenses. So again, seems pretty straightforward on paper, but again, this is something that's introduced in Form 1. And the third thing is, quite simply, just getting used to having a sword, right? So again, there is a huge step from going from open hand to sworded, right? Sworded as in with a sword, not sword as in, but yeah, so the idea is like, all right, so you're not just holding a club, you're not holding a baseball bat. You're learning how to manipulate an actual blade with, again, different segments of the sword. Now in Form 1, there is no canonical defense, right? So you're really only concerned with, again, like the most of the top half, a little bit closer to the top third, where you're just cutting, right? So again, this is a good time for you to think about, all right, so I'm only on the offensive. Let me kind of meditate, kind of like walking meditation. Think about, again, using this portion of the sword. Again, put your mind into it, right? So I know that sounds a little bit strange, but almost like, again, put hyper focus on this. Put your pressure in this if you're, again, into, again, the idea of pressure. So when you move, it's not simply like, I am clubbing away, right? The idea is like, all right, I need to use this portion to cut that person at that distance, right? So it's not just an ethereal thing where I'm kind of like, all right, I'm just going to swing away. No, I need to cut you using, again, this portion, and now you're just in my range, right? So cut, right? So it's not something as simple as, again, just hitting away at any old target. It is, again, using a specific part of a blade, specifically to, with good acceleration and all that fun stuff, to drive into someone's body and drive through. Put yourself in the white belt's position, right? Again, you've never had any martial arts experience, potentially, or at the very least, you haven't done Gumdo before. You may have done maybe some other sword martial art at most. But again, like, all right, you need to be able to draw and sheathe the sword without hurting yourself, which is, so brief side note, I recommend that students learn as early as possible to use either a metal sword or a wooden sword with a scabbard, right? So the earlier you learn how to engage with that scabbard, the more comfortable and more of a swordsman that person will probably feel, right? Because you're actually drawing a blade, right? So when I first learned this, it probably took a long time, right? So again, put yourself in the white belt's shoes. So again, learning how to draw and put the sword away effectively, again, without looking at it, but kind of like keeping in mind everything. Being able to move with potentially a live weapon, right? So again, I wouldn't recommend, per se, giving a white belt a sharp sword just yet. But again, keeping in mind, like, all right, treat it as if it is live, right? As well as, again, engaging the right muscle groups, to breathe effectively, right? So I discussed breathing in the past before. So instead of, again, just like, right, so you really feel, again, your diaphragm kind of like tightening up. As well as simply, again, getting used to holding a blade, right? So again, there is a huge difference between open hand and even open hand using a blunt weapon, right? The minute you kind of introduce a blade, and especially like a sword where it's mostly blade, it kind of changes your perspective on, again, what you can do and kind of how you should behave with your opponent. So I guess with those things in mind, so keep practicing those forms, right? So think about form 1 as you, again, engage with these different concepts. Think about these concepts in different forms, right? So think about the different draws in the different forms, right? So for example, number 3, right? So you still want to have that nice clean block, right? So again, without necessarily having to look at your sword as you're drawing, while making heavy eye contact and be able to move effectively without being worried about it getting stuck in the scabbard, right? So again, think about the draw, think about the motion. Again, as you go up in higher and higher forms, the motions obviously differ, right? So there's a whole different style associated with Ssangsu versus Yedo versus Bangkok. So with that, so keep training, stay humble, and stay safe. Haidong!